I first heard this story when I was a kid. It was one of those life advice stories meant to scare me into making better decisions. It worked. To this day, whenever I hear anything about hitchhiking, I think of Nikki. Nikki was a friend of my dad's, a kind-hearted woman who had a way of making people feel safe, like you'd known her forever. She had a warm laugh, a soft voice, and eyes that always looked like they understood. The kind of person who wanted to help people, who couldn't imagine the world being anything other than good. This story happened in the early 1980s, back when she was in her mid-20s. Hitchhiking wasn't uncommon back then. People still trusted strangers, at least a little. That's probably why she didn't think twice when she saw the man walking along the side of the road. She had been driving into the city, about an hour from her small town, when she spotted him. A lone figure trudging along the highway, his thumb sticking out in the universal sign for a ride. He looked normal enough. Young, maybe late 20s, wearing a faded denim jacket and carrying a duffel bag slung over one shoulder. His hair was a little messy, his face drawn in a way that suggested he'd been walking for a long time. Nikki, being Nikki, pulled over. "Need a ride?" she asked, leaning across the passenger seat to unlock the door. The man hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, just into the city, if you don't mind." She smiled. "No problem." He slid into the car, set his bag in the back seat, and buckled up. For the first half hour, everything was fine. They made small talk. Where he was from, where he was headed, what brought him out this way. He was polite, if a little shy, answering her questions but not offering much in return. His voice was soft, thoughtful, the kind that made you lean in a little just to hear. She learned his name, Tom, that he was from a few towns over, that he was heading to the city for work, though he never said what kind of job he was looking for. They talked about music, the weather, the way gas prices kept climbing. For a while, Nikki thought she had made a new friend. They were halfway to the city when she pulled into a small roadside diner for a break. "You hungry?" she asked as she parked. Tom hesitated again, like he wasn't sure how to answer. "Come on," she said, already reaching for her purse. "I'm starving." She bought him dinner, just a simple burger and fries, but he looked so flustered when she paid for it, like he wasn't used to people doing nice things for him. At the time, she thought it was sweet. How awkward he got. How he kept mumbling, "You really don't have to do that," as she waved him off. They sat in a booth, eating quietly. If Nikki had been paying attention, she might have noticed how his hands shook a little when he picked up his cup, how his eyes kept flicking toward the door, then back to her. But she didn't, because to her, this was just a nice moment. A stranger turned friend. After dinner, they got back on the road. The conversation didn't pick up again in the same way. He was quieter now, more withdrawn, but she figured he was just tired. By the time they reached the city, the sun had already set, the streetlights blinking on in lazy intervals. "This okay?" she asked as she pulled up to a corner downtown. Tom nodded. "Yeah, this is great. Thanks." He reached for the door, then hesitated. "Hey," he said, turning back to her. "Can I have your number? You know, to keep in touch?" Nikki grinned and scribbled it down on a napkin. "Call me anytime," she said. He took it, stuffed it into his pocket, got out of the car, and disappeared into the crowd. For the next week, Nikki didn't think about him much. Then he called. She picked up, expecting a friendly chat, maybe a thank you. What she got instead made her blood run cold. His voice was different this time. Flat. Empty. "You should thank God you were so nice," he said. Nikki's breath caught. "What?" "When I got into your car," he continued, his voice chillingly calm, "I was planning on killing you." Her stomach turned. What are you talking about?" He didn't stop. "I was going to wait until the pit stop. I was going to take your car. Leave your body in a ditch somewhere." A sharp ringing filled her ears. She thought she might be sick. "But you were so kind," he said. "You talked to me like I was a person. You bought me dinner. And I couldn't do it." Her hands were shaking now. "You're lying," she whispered, though she knew he wasn't. "You should never pick up another hitchhiker," he said. His voice was softer now, almost sad. "You got lucky this time. Next time, you might not." Then he hung up. The number was traced to a payphone. No way to call back. No way to know where he had gone. Nikki never picked up another hitchhiker after that. For years, she tried to forget. But every time she heard a news story about a missing woman, every time she passed an empty stretch of highway, every time she saw a lone figure with their thumb outstretched, she thought of him, and she wondered how many other drivers weren't as lucky as her. I used to think I was invincible. Maybe it was the arrogance of youth, that feeling that bad things only happen to other people. Or maybe it was because I had already survived my fair share of scary experiences. A stalker when I was younger, a few too many close calls growing up in a rough neighborhood. Whatever the reason, I had convinced myself that nothing worse could happen to me. That was before the night I got into the wrong car. I was 19, still figuring my life out, still struggling to afford a car of my own. Most nights, I walked everywhere. Occasionally, I caught a ride with a friend. And sometimes, I hitchhiked. It was a rule I never broke. Never get into a car with a lone man. Only women, or men with wives, girlfriends, or kids in the car. That was my system. It kept me safe. Until the night I ignored it. It had been a long shift at work. My feet ached, my eyes burned from exhaustion, and the cold night air cut through my jacket like I wasn't even wearing one. I was halfway through my usual walk home when I saw headlights approaching in the distance. I stuck out my thumb. The car slowed. A sedan, old but well kept, the kind you'd see a dad drive to work every morning. I stepped forward, squinting as the window rolled down. The driver was alone. That should have been my first red flag. But I sized him up quickly. Thin, unremarkable, not much taller than me. He didn't look threatening. Besides, it was freezing, and I was too exhausted to be picky. "Where are you headed?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost soft. I gave him the name of the street near my house. "Hop in," he said. I hesitated, my brain warning me, "You don't get in cars with lone men." But my body was cold, my limbs were sore, and he looked harmless enough. I opened the door and got in. At first, everything seemed fine. We talked a little, just the usual small talk. Was I local? Did I like the area? What did I do for work? He told me he had only lived in town for a couple of months. Trying to start fresh, he said. I didn't think much of it. Then the snow started falling. The temperature dropped fast, and the roads got slick. The man fell silent, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. Eyes locked straight ahead. I didn't mind the silence. I never liked small talk anyway. A few minutes passed, just the soft hum of the engine and the occasional swish of the windshield wipers. Then I saw it, a car coming toward the intersection ahead of us, moving too fast. "Careful," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet. "That car looks like it's sliding." Before I could finish my sentence, he slammed his foot down on the gas. The car lurched forward, shooting through the intersection. "Don't ever scream at me," he hissed. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't screaming," I said quickly, forcing my voice to stay calm. He didn't respond. The air inside the car felt different now. Thick, suffocating. I swallowed hard, keeping my hands still in my lap. "Don't panic. Don't make him mad. This is close enough," I said, forcing a small laugh. "You can drop me off here. I don't mind walking the rest of the way." He didn't slow down. I tried again. "Did you hear me? You can pull over here." Nothing. His hands were clenched white-knuckle tight around the wheel. His eyes never left the road. A cold, creeping fear crawled up my spine. I reached for the door handle. It wasn't there. Just a hollow hole where the handle should have been. I went still. I don't remember breathing. I don't remember blinking. I just sat there, staring at that empty hole, realization settling over me like a lead blanket. I was trapped. The car picked up speed. The snow outside blurred past us, white streaks against the darkness. My mind raced. What do I do? Do I grab the wheel? Do I scream? Do I hit him? I couldn't think straight. My heart was pounding too hard, my throat dry and useless. Then, he started mumbling. I barely heard it at first. A low whisper under his breath, words tumbling over each other too fast to make sense of. I strained to listen. "You're always yelling at me." I told them before. I told them not to yell, but do they listen? No, never. Not you too. I'm done listening. His fingers twitched against the wheel. Something about the way he was talking made my stomach twist. I forced my voice to stay even. I'm not yelling, I said. I was just saying you can drop me off. No big deal. He blinked rapidly. For the first time since his outburst, he turned to look at me. His eyes were too wide, his pupils like dark, bottomless pits. I couldn't breathe. The car slowed. A gas station came into view. Without a word, he pulled into the parking lot, the tires crunching over the snow. I sat frozen, waiting, terrified he would change his mind. Then, in a quiet, almost apologetic voice, he said, "I think I better let you out here." He unlocked the doors. I didn't hesitate. I pushed the door open and practically fell out of the car, my legs shaking beneath me. I ran straight for the gas station, not looking back. I didn't breathe again until I was inside, the bright fluorescent lights burning into my vision. The cashier looked up. "You okay?" I nodded quickly, even though I wasn't. I risked a glance over my shoulder. The man was still sitting in the car, his head bowed, hands gripping the steering wheel. I didn't know what he was thinking. I didn't care. I turned back toward the counter, ready to ask to use the phone, when I heard my name. I turned back slowly. The man had rolled down his window. He was holding something in his hand. My hat. I had left it in his car. I didn't want to go near him, but something about the way he was sitting, so still, so quiet, like he was waiting for something, made me hesitate. I stepped forward, just enough to grab the hat from his outstretched hand. "I'm sorry," he murmured. Then he drove away. I stood there, watching until his taillights disappeared into the snow. Only then did I notice the folded piece of paper tucked inside my hat. I unfolded it with numb fingers. Inside was a $100 bill and a short, scrawled note. "I'm sorry. Please take a cab home, and don't hitchhike anymore." I never did. When my husband pulled the car over, I knew immediately it was a mistake. We had been driving back from a weekend trip, just the two of us, the sun beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows over the road. It was the kind of evening that made the world feel quiet, almost peaceful. But that peace shattered the moment I saw the man standing on the side of the road, his thumb out, his face barely visible in the dim light. I had always been taught never to pick up hitchhikers. My parents drilled that into me since childhood. But my husband wasn't like me. He always saw the good in people, always believed that the world wasn't as dangerous as people made it seem. So when he slowed the car and pulled over, I felt my stomach drop. The man jogged up to the passenger side and leaned in. He was young, maybe in his late 20s or early 30s, with long dark brown hair, tan skin, and muscular arms. There was something about him that reminded me of the kind of guys who worked construction, strong, easygoing, and relaxed. But as soon as I met his eyes, something in my gut twisted. "Thanks, man. Just need a ride down the road," he said, his voice smooth, friendly. Before I could say anything, my husband had already nodded. "Hop in." The man slid into the back seat, tossing his worn-out backpack beside him. I kept my hands tight in my lap, staring straight ahead. I didn't like this. I didn't like him. At first, the ride was uneventful. My husband struck up conversation, talking about music, which the man, he said his name was Will, was all too happy to join in on. They bonded over classic rock, old concerts, and bands that had faded into history. I sat quietly, pretending to listen, but really, I was watching him in the mirror. Something about the way he moved put me on edge. He was too comfortable. His shoulders were too loose, his grin a little too easy. "Where are you headed?" my husband asked. Will stretched his arms over his head before answering. Nowhere specific. Just visiting friends. Crashing where I can, you know?" I caught his gaze in the mirror. He was watching me. I turned away, forcing myself to look at the road. When we reached our town, my husband did something that made my blood go cold. He invited him over. "Why don't you come hang out for a bit? Have a beer. Rest up before heading out?" I could feel my nails digging into my palms, but I said nothing. Will smiled. "Yeah, man, that sounds good." And just like that, we brought a stranger into our home. Will settled in too easily. It was like he had been waiting for an invitation. He drank beer with my husband, played guitar with him, laughed like they were old friends. I stayed quiet, watching from the kitchen, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. But then he told us something that made my skin crawl. It was late, the living room dimly lit by the glow of a single lamp, and my husband asked what he had been up to lately. His response was too casual. "Oh, I saw a guy get murdered last week." The words hung in the air. My husband laughed, thinking it was a joke. "No way." Well, just shrugged. "Yeah, was at the lake with some buddies. They got into a fight, and one of them beat the other to death. Used a shovel." He took another sip of beer, completely unfazed. I stared at him, waiting for some kind of reaction. Remorse, horror, anything. But there was nothing. I wanted to tell my husband to kick him out, right then, but I didn't. I convinced myself that he was just a messed up guy with a messed up life. I convinced myself I was being paranoid. That was my mistake. As the night dragged on, I got tired. My husband and Will were still drinking, still talking. So I excused myself to go to bed. I was barely asleep when I felt it, the shift in the air. A presence. I opened my eyes. My husband was sitting upright in bed, his back against the headboard, wide awake. Something was wrong. "What's going on?" I whispered. He didn't look at me. His eyes were locked on the bedroom door. "He's still awake," he murmured. My breath caught in my throat. My husband wasn't the paranoid type. He wasn't someone who scared easily. But there was a knife on the nightstand beside him. I sat up slowly. "What happened?" He didn't answer at first. Then, after a long pause, he said, "I don't think he saw a murder. I think he did it." The words sent a shock of cold terror through my veins. I didn't ask how he knew. I didn't need to. There was something off about Will. Something that felt wrong, dangerous. My husband didn't sleep that night. He sat there, gripping the knife, waiting, watching. I lay awake beside him, listening. At some point, I heard it. A slow, deliberate creak outside the bedroom door. Someone was standing there, listening. The air was thick with silence. I didn't move. Neither did my husband. We waited. After what felt like forever, the footsteps retreated. We never saw Will again after that night. The next morning, my husband drove him a few miles down the road, dropped him off without a word, and left him there. Will never tried to contact us again. A few years later, my husband ran into him at a gas station. Will didn't recognize him, or maybe he pretended not to. Either way, we never spoke of him again. But I still think about that night. About the way my husband sat awake, gripping that knife, convinced that if he had fallen asleep, he wouldn't have woken up. My aunt was always the adventurous type, growing up in the 1970s, a time when the world seemed a little safer, when people trusted one another more. She lived with that sense of invincibility many young people have. She was in her teens, enjoying the freedoms that came with being a teenager in a smaller town, far from the dangers that the big cities seemed to have. Back then, hitchhiking was a norm, a method of travel that seemed more charming than dangerous. It was something people did all the time. But she had no idea that one afternoon, that simple decision to thumb a ride would become a story that would haunt her for the rest of her life. It all started on a bright, sunny morning in the mid-70s. My aunt and her two closest friends had decided to skip school that day, just for fun. No real reason. Other than the fact that they were teenagers and wanted to explore, to do something spontaneous. They had planned to head across town to the local mall, a place they'd heard a lot about, but had never had the chance to visit. Problem was, none of them had a car. It wasn't the first time they'd done something like this. They'd hitchhiked before, and they knew the routine. Stick your thumb out, wait for a ride, and get where you need to go. Simple. But something about this time felt different. They were more carefree than usual. Maybe because it was a school day, and they felt they had a little more freedom. The world was still a safer place, or at least it seemed that way. They walked to the side of the highway, where cars occasionally passed by, and started their usual routine, thumb out, waiting for someone to stop. It didn't take long. A car pulled up to the side of the road. A nice, clean sedan with the windows rolled down. Inside was a man, perhaps in his late 20s or early 30s. He was handsome, well-groomed with neatly combed hair, wearing a simple button-up shirt and slacks. He didn't look like the kind of person you'd think twice about. The man smiled warmly at them, his eyes kind and reassuring. "Where you girls headed?" he asked in a calm, friendly voice. At this point, the girls felt completely at ease. He looked like an everyday person, someone you might see working in an office or a store, someone who seemed entirely unthreatening. Without hesitation, they piled into the car, laughing, chatting as they settled into their seats. The ride started innocently enough. The man's name was Ted, or so he told them. He had a friendly way about him, a conversationalist who made everyone feel comfortable. He didn't seem like a stranger, but like someone they had known for years. He asked them where they were from, about their favorite bands, their plans for the future. They laughed, they shared stories, and for a brief moment, it felt like just a casual ride with a stranger who wasn't a stranger at all. As they drove, the conversation continued, and Ted seemed genuinely interested in what they had to say. He asked about their favorite movies, about the latest news in their small town. The girls started to feel like he was an older brother, someone who understood them in ways that most people didn't. When they reached the mall, Ted offered to drop them off right in front of the entrance. He didn't seem eager to rush them out of the car, and that made them feel even more comfortable with him. He seemed like the kind of guy who wouldn't hurt a fly. "Take care, girls," he said, flashing them that warm smile again as they got out of the car. "Maybe I'll see you around sometime." And just like that, the ride was over. They went about their day, shopping, eating at the food court, and having fun as young girls often do when they feel the excitement of having a day off from school. They forgot about the ride, about the strange man who had been so kind to them, and just enjoyed their time together. That night, when my aunt was watching TV, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A news report came on, something about a man who had been arrested for raping and murdering young women. The reporter detailed how he had been active in several towns, picking up girls, luring them with his charm, and then killing them. The description of the man matched the image that had been burned into my aunt's mind. The man who had picked her and her friends up that afternoon. It was him. My aunt's heart dropped. She went cold, her hands trembling as she sat in front of the TV, staring at the screen. She didn't even need to hear the name to recognize the face. The moment the camera zoomed in on him, she knew it was Ted. She immediately thought about everything that had happened during the ride. He had been so friendly, so normal. How could someone so kind, someone who had chatted so easily with them, be capable of something so horrifying? My aunt couldn't sleep that night. She stayed awake, replaying everything in her head. The way he had smiled at them, the way he had listened to their stories, how kind and welcoming he had seemed. And now, it was all twisted, all tainted by the revelation of what he had done. Over the next few days, my aunt and her friends couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible could have happened. They wondered what would have happened if they had stayed in the car longer, if they had made a different decision, or if Ted had taken a different route. And then, it came to light that Ted Bundy had been one of the most notorious serial killers in history. A man who had confessed to killing at least 30 women. He had traveled from state to state, picking up hitchhikers, gaining their trust, and then, when they were too trusting, when they felt safe, he would attack. My aunt never went anywhere near the road again, never hitched another ride for the rest of her life. She couldn't. The memory of that day, the memory of that ride, stayed with her forever. She would often tell me about it when I was older, in that same casual tone that adults use to tell stories that are almost too unbelievable to be true. But the look in her eyes, the one that came with the story, told me everything I needed to know. She never told anyone how close she had come to becoming one of Bundy's victims, how easily it could have been her. She never hitchhiked again, and neither did I. For years, I couldn't shake the thought of how a simple, kind interaction, a moment where she felt safe, welcomed, like a friend, had turned into one of the most dangerous decisions she had ever made. It wasn't just about the ride. It wasn't just about Ted. It was about how easily people can hide their true intentions, how deceptive charm can be, and how much we take for granted until the moment we realize we were almost a statistic. Years passed, and she shared the story with me many times, but it always ended the same way. A simple ride, a simple act of kindness, and a memory that would stay with her forever. After everything, my aunt finally had one piece of advice she would give to me. Trust your instincts. Always trust your instincts, no matter how friendly someone may seem. And after hearing the story again, I always will. This happened when I was 21. I was in college at the time, living in southern Ohio, about 45 minutes outside of Cincinnati. My campus was small, tucked away from the larger cities, and most of my friends had scattered to different schools across the Midwest. I spent most of my time alone, keeping my head down, getting through my classes, and making the occasional weekend trip to visit friends. It was a Friday evening, and I had just finished packing up my car for a weekend road trip. My plan was simple: drive 2 hours, crash at my buddy Kyle's dorm, and spend the weekend drinking, eating garbage, and pretending we didn't have responsibilities. I had made this drive before, at least 30 times, and I didn't even need my GPS anymore. The roads were familiar, the route second nature. But that night, everything went wrong. About 15 minutes into my drive, I got a call from my girlfriend. I wasn't expecting it, and when I answered, I could tell she was stressed. Her car had broken down in her dorm parking lot. She was supposed to work that night, and now she had no way to get there. "Can you come get me?" she asked. I checked my GPS. Her dorm was about 20 minutes in the opposite direction, but I knew if I didn't help her, I'd feel guilty the entire weekend. So I sighed, pulled over to check the quickest route, and turned the car around. That was my first mistake. Instead of backtracking the way I came, my GPS suggested a shortcut. It was an exit I had passed dozens of times, but had never taken. The route seemed fine, a straight shot, a few winding roads through some rural areas, and I'd be at her dorm in no time. So I took it. The road was narrow, lined with thick woods on both sides. It was getting dark fast, and the trees cast long, skeletal shadows across the pavement. I was about 10 minutes in when I saw the car. A Toyota pulled off to the side of the road, its hood propped open. A man stood next to it, head bent over the engine, inspecting something under the hood. As I slowed down, he looked up. He was normal looking, short brown hair, brown eyes, wearing a button-up shirt and slacks like he had just come from work. He smiled and waved. I should have kept driving, but I didn't. I rolled down my window. "Everything okay?" The man straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. "Yeah, I think so. Just some engine trouble." There was nothing strange about him. His car was nice, his clothes were clean, and his voice was calm, collected. But when I offered to let him use my phone to call someone, he shook his head. "Oh no, that's okay. I have a service coming to get it, but they're closed until morning. I hate to ask, but could you give me a ride to my brother's place? He only lives about 4 minutes away." That should have been my second red flag. Why couldn't he use my phone to call his brother? If it was just 4 minutes, why couldn't he walk? But he looked completely harmless. So I unlocked the door. He got in. At first, everything was fine. We drove in silence for a few minutes. The road was dark, the woods pressing in on both sides, and I focused on the GPS. The turnoff he mentioned hadn't come up yet, but I figured it must be close. Then, he started acting weird. Every time a curse word came up in my music, he flinched. Not just a little. His whole body tensed up, like he had been shocked. I noticed it the first time, thought maybe he was just weird about swearing. But then he reached over and hit the power button on my radio. Just slammed his hand down and turned it off. I glanced at him. "Not your style?" He didn't answer. His whole demeanor had shifted. His hands were clenched into fists, his jaw tight. I tried to make a joke, something stupid like, "Man, if you hate my music that much, you could have just asked." Nothing. That's when I started to feel uneasy. I checked the GPS. We had been driving for 10 minutes. He said his brother's house was 4 minutes away. I forced a casual tone. "Hey, how much farther? I actually have somewhere to be soon." His head snapped toward me so fast I jumped. "Just a little longer," he said. His voice was different now. Flat. Emotionless. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get him out of my car. I gripped the steering wheel. "Actually, this is as far as I can take you. You'll have to walk the rest of the way." His mood changed instantly. Not anger. Panic. "No, no, please, just a little further." I shook my head. "Nah, man. I'm already late." Then he did something that made my stomach drop. He reached into his pocket, and pulled out his wallet. "I'll pay you," he said, flipping it open. "Just take me the rest of the way." A thick stack of 20s was folded inside, and something else, something small, plastic, and clear. It fell out of the wallet and onto the seat between us. I barely got a glance before he snatched it up and shoved it back into his pocket. But I saw it. A Ziploc bag, full of teeth, human teeth. I felt pure, ice-cold terror. My body reacted before my brain did. I slammed the brakes, throwing both of us forward. "What the hell, man?" he yelled. "Get the hell out of my car," I snapped. He looked at me, his mouth slightly open, like he couldn't understand why I was upset. I reached under my seat, gripping the metal tire iron I kept there. "If you don't get out, I'll make you get out." For a second, I thought he was going to try something. Then, slowly, he opened the door and stepped out. He didn't run. He didn't yell or threaten me. He just stood there, watching as I peeled off down the road, my tires kicking up gravel. I drove 10 miles before I pulled over to call the police. They told me not to pick up hitchhikers again, that there was nothing they could do since he hadn't actually committed a crime in front of me. They never found him. I still wonder what he was planning. Where was he really trying to go? And why the hell was he carrying around a bag of human teeth? I never picked up another hitchhiker again, and I never will.